It happened after the fire. After the showdown. After the mountaintop victory that should have changed everything. Elijah had just called down fire from heaven. He stood on Mount Carmel before hundreds of false prophets and an entire nation watching. He prayed, just a simple, earnest prayer, and fire fell. Real fire. From the sky. It consumed the altar, the stones, the sacrifice, the water. The people fell to their faces and cried out, "The Lord, He is God." And for a moment, it seemed like revival had come. Elijah had done it. The prophet who once stood alone now stood vindicated. The rain returned after 3 long years of drought. God had answered. Everything should have changed. But it didn't. Queen Jezebel didn't repent. She sent a message, a threat. By this time tomorrow, she said, "You'll be dead." And just like that, the prophet who called fire from heaven ran for his life. Not to fight, not to preach, but to hide, to escape, to disappear. Elijah fled into the wilderness. He left his servant behind. He walked a day's journey alone. And then, beneath a solitary tree, he prayed again. But this time, the prayer wasn't for fire. It was for death. "I have had enough, Lord," he said, "take my life." This was Elijah's darkest day. Not on the mountain, but in the valley that came after. Because sometimes the greatest battles don't come before the victory, they come after. And the ones who seem strongest can carry wounds no one sees. This was the man who stood fearless before kings. Now, he was undone by a whisper of fear. And that tells us something important. Even prophets break. Even heroes get tired. Even faithful servants reach a point where the weight feels unbearable. Elijah didn't run because he was weak. He ran because he was human. He had given everything. And now, he felt empty, alone, done. That's the danger of mountaintop moments. We assume they'll sustain us forever. But the truth is, the enemy often attacks hardest after the fire falls. When adrenaline fades. When expectations crash. When God's response didn't fix what we hoped it would. Elijah thought the fire would change everything. But Jezebel still ruled. Fear still lived. The people still wavered. And Elijah crumbled. But here's where the story turns. Elijah lay down under the tree and slept. And God didn't scold him. He didn't say, "How could you doubt after all I've done?" He sent an angel. With food. With water. With rest. Not a sermon. Not a rebuke. Just bread baked over coals. Just care. Because sometimes what we need most isn't more power, it's presence. Not a new miracle, but a moment of mercy. God knew Elijah's body was tired. His soul depleted. His heart overwhelmed. So he met him in the wilderness, not with lightning, but with lunch. And the angel said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." What tenderness! What truth! God didn't ask Elijah to push through. He invited him to rest. And Elijah did. He ate. He drank. He slept again. Because when your darkest day comes, when everything inside you wants to quit, the first step back isn't victory. It's rest. And from that rest, Elijah rose. He traveled for 40 days. Not back to the people. Not back to the palace. But to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. The place where Moses once stood in glory. And there, in a cave, Elijah hid, still hurting, still asking why, still wrestling with the same question so many of us carry in silence. If I did everything right, why'd I feel so wrong? Insert midpoint call to action. If you've ever found yourself there, burnt out after doing your best, discouraged after a spiritual high, confused when God's power didn't change your pain, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. This story isn't just about Elijah. It's about all of us. And someone else may need to hear this truth too. Let's continue. God spoke, not with fire this time, not with thunder or earthquake, but with a whisper, a still, small voice. And in that silence, Elijah heard what he couldn't hear before. Not answers, but presence. Not reasons, but relationship. God reminded Elijah that he was not alone. That the story was not over. That there were still 7,000 others who had not bowed to Baal. And that God's plan was still moving forward, even if Elijah couldn't see it. That's the power of the whisper. It tells us, God is still here. Even when the fire is gone. Even when the crowds have scattered. Even when the fear feels louder than the promise. God is still speaking. And He's not disappointed in your despair. He draws near in it. Elijah's darkest day didn't disqualify him. It deepened him. It brought him to the mountain. Not in triumph, but in truth. Because the valley strips away illusion. And what's left is the raw, honest heart. That's what God wants. Not just the prophet who calls down fire. But the man who says, I can't go on. Both are holy. Both are heard. And God met both with compassion. After the whisper, God gave Elijah something even greater than renewal. He gave him assignment, a new direction, a new generation to raise. He told him to anoint new kings, to call Elisha, the one who would walk with him, learn from him, carry the mantle when Elijah's time was done. Because Elijah's story wasn't ending. It was evolving. It wasn't the end of his ministry. It was the beginning of his legacy. That's the beauty of God's grace. He doesn't discard us in the dark. He meets us there, and gives us purpose again. Elijah walked out of that cave not just with renewed strength, but with a wider vision. He knew now that he wasn't the only one. That God's work was bigger than his role. That the future didn't rest solely on his shoulders. And that's what some of us need to hear today. You are not the whole story. But you are still part of it. God doesn't need your strength. He desires your surrender. He can work through you, even when you're weak. Even when you're doubting. Even when you're asking to die under a tree. That is not the end of you. That is the place where God begins to rebuild. With gentleness. With food. With rest. With truth. And with new vision. Elijah's journey didn't go back to what it was. He didn't return to the same fire-calling prophet. He moved into mentorship. He raised up Elisha. He walked toward the finish line, not with shame, but with peace. Because when your darkest day passes, and the whisper finds you, you begin to see that the valley was not a detour. It was the deepening. It was where God taught you not just to call down fire, but to hear the whisper. Not just to speak to crowds, but to sit with silence. Not just to act boldly, but to rest deeply. That's what Elijah carried now. And when his final day came, he didn't die in despair. He was taken, in a whirlwind, in glory, in a chariot of fire. Because the man who once asked to die beneath a tree finished his life lifted into heaven. That is redemption. That is hope. That is the God we serve. One who meets us in caves and crowns us in chariots. Who listens to our lowest prayers and still calls us higher. Who doesn't discard us when we fall apart, but comes near, whispers, and reminds us, this is not the end. That's Elijah's story. That's our story too. So if today feels like you're Mount Horeb, if you're under a tree asking for it to end, if you're hiding in a cave wondering where God went, know this. You are not abandoned. You are not weak. You are not done. You are being met, maybe not with fire, maybe not with thunder, but with a whisper, a presence that says, get up, eat, rest, I'm still here. And when you do, when you take that next small step, even if it's shaky, you begin to move again. Not back to what was, but forward into what will be. Elijah's legacy didn't come from his victories alone. It came from his honesty, his surrender, his willingness to bring his despair to God and stay long enough to hear the whisper. So don't run from the silence. Don't fear the valley. Don't despise the cave. That's where God often speaks clearest. Where He reshapes us. Where He sends us again. And maybe, just maybe, what you thought was the end is actually the beginning. Elijah thought his life was over. But God was just turning the page. He had more to write, more to reveal, more to restore. And the same is true for you. The whisper still speaks. The presence still stays. The God of fire is also the God of gentle silence. And he knows what you need. Not what the world expects. Not what your fear demands. But what your heart truly aches for. Peace, assurance, companionship, purpose. And that's what Elijah found in his darkest day. He didn't get a dramatic rescue. He got daily bread. He didn't get a crowd. He got one successor. He didn't get his old fire. He got new oil. Quiet, lasting, steady. So ask yourself, what if the cave isn't the curse? What if it's the classroom? What if the silence is not punishment, but preparation? What if this low place is where your real legacy begins? Not when you rise, but when you let God meet you as you are. Tired, afraid, done, and still loved, still chosen, still part of the plan. That's the gospel in Elijah's story. That's the grace in your own. You're not too far. You're not too broken. And you're never too lost for God to find. He already knows where you are. And he's already coming close. Not with judgment, but with a whisper. Let him speak. Let him stay. Let him restore. Because the cave isn't your coffin. It's your commissioning. And what comes next may be quieter, but deeper. Truer. Wiser. Because now you know the God of both fire and whisper. And you will never be the same. And that knowledge, that deep, quiet knowing, will change the way you walk. No longer trying to prove. No longer striving to impress. No longer measuring worth by fire or applause. But resting in presence. Moving with purpose. Living from the whisper. That's what Elijah carried after the cave. He didn't shout louder. He walked closer. With God. With Elisha. With a new clarity that comes only after the breaking. And maybe that's what this moment is birthing in you. A gentler strength. A quieter confidence. A more honest faith. Not one that ignores the pain, but one that has met God in the middle of it. That's real faith. Not polished, but proven. Not loud, but lasting. And the world needs more Elijahs like that. Not the ones who only call down fire, but the ones who rise from caves. Who walk with limp and wisdom. Who know the darkness and the deliverer. Who don't need to be seen, because they've been known by the one who whispers. So if you're in the cave right now, if your soul is tired, your prayers are quiet, your joy feels distant, know this, you're in holy company. You walk the same road Elijah walked. And the God who met him still meets his people there. With bread, with rest, with truth, with calling. And when he sends you again, you won't go alone. He'll raise up others. He'll carry what you cannot. He'll walk the road with you. Because your darkest day is not your final word. It is the ground where deeper faith grows. Where new vision is born. Where legacy begins. And when your final day comes, it won't be marked by defeat. It will be a chariot, a flame, a moment of glory, not because you were strong, but because you were his. Elijah's story reminds us that even the mightiest fall. But God doesn't leave them there. He lifts them, feeds them, speaks to them, and sends them again. Because he's not finished. Not with Elijah. Not with you. Not with anyone who's willing to be honest in the cave and listen for the whisper. That's where healing begins. That's where hope is reborn. That's where the next chapter starts, quiet, steady, full of grace. So rest, rise, listen, and go. The whisper is calling you forward, even from your darkest day. And when you emerge from the cave, change. Quieter, deeper. You'll carry something the fire could never give you. An anchor. You'll know God not just as the one who answers with power, but as the one who stays with presence. The one who feeds when you're weak. The one who whispers when you're raw. The one who doesn't walk away when you're done. Elijah's fire proved who God was to a nation. But Elijah's cave revealed who God was to him. And that is a greater treasure. Because nations forget, Crowds scatter. Altars crumble. But intimacy remains. That's what Elijah left the mountain with. Not a renewed platform, but a restored heart. He was no longer trying to prove himself. He was walking in step with the God who had proven faithful. That's what your cave can become. A place of encounter. A turning point. A place where you unlearn striving and relearn trust. Where you stop fighting for significance and start walking in surrender. Where you no longer ask, "Am I enough?" because you've heard the whisper say, "You are mine." That's what changes you. And when you go back, not to the mountaintop, but to the mundane, you go different. You speak different. You love different. Because you've been with God. Not just in public, but in private pain. That's the Elijah we need in this hour. Not the man on fire, but the man who listened. The one who didn't quit when he wanted to die. The one who got up, slow, tired, still human, but obedient. Because legacy isn't written in fire. It's written in footsteps, one after the other, in silence, in surrender, and in whispers that keep us going when the world gets loud. Elijah's darkest day taught him that, and maybe yours is teaching you too. Don't give up, even if the fire's gone, even if the rain hasn't come, even if no one understands. The whisper still speaks, and when it does, everything changes. Not always around you, but always within you, and that, more than fire, is what transforms the world. So let the fire fall, yes. But don't forget the cave. Don't forget the place where God met you when no one else could. Don't despise the moment when all you had left was a whisper, and found out that it was enough. Because in that moment, your faith became real, your identity was clarified, your calling was refined, not through applause, but through ashes, not through triumph, but through trembling. That's the kind of faith that endures. That's the kind of story that lasts. And when the generations look back, they won't remember just what you built. They'll remember how you endured, how you listened when others shouted, how you loved when others left, how you rose from your lowest place and walked quietly, humbly, faithfully, into the rest of your assignment. That's Elijah's story, and it can be yours. So don't fear your darkest day. Don't run from the moment everything breaks. That might be where everything begins. Where God comes closest. Where grace is most real. And where your life shifts, not into something louder, but something deeper. Let it. Lean into it. And when you hear the whisper again, follow it. It will lead you where fire never could. To legacy. To rest. To a God who is more than power. He is present. More than sovereign, he is near. More than mighty, he is gentle. And in that gentleness, he will carry you out of the cave, into the next chapter, with strength not born from success, but from surrender. That is Elijah's legacy, and it begins in the dark, with a whisper. So if you're sitting under your own broom tree right now, wondering if it's worth going on, wondering if the fire meant anything, wondering if the fear wins, hear this. You're not the first to feel this way, and you won't be the last. But the God who met Elijah in the wilderness is still here. Still speaking, still staying. He's not in a hurry. He's not disappointed. He's not waiting for you to fix yourself. He's kneeling beside you, with bread, with silence, with kindness, because your heart matters more to him than your performance. Your rest means more than your results. He would rather restore you than replace you. That's who he is. And one day, maybe not today, but soon, you'll rise. Not as who you used to be, but as someone wiser, softer, stronger in ways the world can't see. And you'll carry something holy. A story forged in the fire. Yes, but rooted in the whisper. A legacy built not on mountaintops, but in caves, where the bravest thing you did wasn't calling down fire, but getting up when you had nothing left. That's the Elijah we honor. Not just the prophet of boldness, but the man of surrender. The one who taught us that even God's strongest servants can break. And that's not failure. It's formation. So let yourself feel what you feel. Cry if you must. Collapse if you have to. But don't quit. God is near. And He's not done. What feels like death may be the doorway to the next thing. And the whisper? It's still waiting. It still speaks. It still calls. And when you answer, the next chapter begins. Not in fire, but in faith. Because at the end of the day, it's not the fire that sustains you. It's not the miracles that carry you. It's the whisper, the quiet voice of God saying, I see you. I know. I'm not leaving. And that is enough. Enough to heal. Enough to hope. Enough to take one more step. So listen again. To the silence. To the presence. To the still, small voice. Let it remind you of who you are, and whose you are. You are not forgotten. You are not failing. You are not done. You are Elijah. And your story, even in the darkest day, still matters. Still continues. Still echoes with the God who meets us. In the fire. In the fear. In the cave. And most of all, in the whisper. So walk forward gently. You don't have to run. You don't have to roar. Just listen. And follow. Even from your darkest place, the whisper still leads home. And one day, when you look back, you'll see the cave differently. Not as the place you failed, but the place God found you. And that, more than the fire, will be the moment that changed everything. Because that was the day you learned. The whisper was enough. So don't wait for the fire to prove He's near. Trust the silence. Trust the stillness. That's where He is. That's where He heals. And that's where He sends you again, not with noise, but with knowing. You've been with God, and that's enough. So get up slowly. Eat the bread. Drink the water. Let your heart rest. The journey is long, but He is with you. And the whisper is waiting. And when you rise from your cave, you will rise different, not louder, but deeper, not prouder, but clearer. Because the God who met you there, in your darkest day, still walks with you now. And He always will. Because even after your darkest day, the whisper still calls you forward. And He still has more for you. So keep walking, not because it's easy, but because He's with you. And where He leads, life begins again, even after the darkest day. This is not the end of your story. It's the place where God begins something new. So take the next step. The whisper is waiting. And He'll meet you there, just like He did with Elijah. Because the God who called Elijah out of despair is still calling you. Not to prove, not to perform, but to be with Him. And from that place, everything begins again. In peace, in purpose, in the whisper. So rest if you must. Cry if you need. But don't forget, the whisper still speaks your name. And your story is not over yet. Even in the quiet, God is still writing. And the next chapter begins with a whisper and a step.